Have you ever wondered why great empires fall? For 500 years, the exact same pattern has repeated itself. Every superpower, from Spain to Great Britain to the United States, believed it was exceptional, that the rules didn't apply to them. But the result was always the same: collapse. Today, we're diving deep into the 7-stage model that destroyed the most powerful empires of the modern world. And our first case study, the first victim of this model, was the mighty Spanish Empire. So how did Spain even become this unstoppable superpower in the first place? Picture this. It's the mid-1500s. Spain isn't just a country, it's the richest, most dominant empire in history. They have unimaginable wealth pouring in from the Americas, literally tons and tons of silver. This wealth funds the largest and most feared army in Europe. On the seas, their fleet is unmatched, the most powerful in the world. They control vast territories across the globe. To the outside world, Spain looked invincible. But this very power, this overwhelming wealth and military might, contained the seeds of its own destruction. It was a ticking time bomb, and the countdown had already begun. This is where our 7-stage model of collapse kicks in. Stage 1. Military overexpansion. Spain wasn't just fighting one war, it was fighting on nearly every continent simultaneously. They were battling the Ottomans in the Mediterranean, Protestants in the Netherlands, and rivals in the Americas and Asia. Maintaining these massive armies and fleets was incredibly expensive. The cost of soldiers, ships, and supplies was astronomical. The government raised taxes, but it was never enough to cover the bills. So what did they do? They started borrowing. Heavily. This wasn't a temporary fix. It was the beginning of a dangerous habit. Every new conflict meant more debt, pushing the empire closer to a financial cliff. They were stretching themselves too thin. A classic mistake that many great powers would later repeat. The empire's reach exceeded its grasp, and the financial strain was becoming unbearable. Now for stage 2, currency devaluation. This is where things get really interesting. You'd think all that silver from the Americas would make Spain permanently rich, right? Wrong. It actually crashed their economy. It's a simple case of supply and demand. When you flood the market with too much of something, its value drops. Spain had so much silver pouring in that it caused massive inflation. Prices for everything, food, goods, labor, skyrocketed. The silver coins in people's pockets were suddenly worth less and less. Imagine your life savings losing half its value overnight. That's what happened. The very treasure that was meant to be the bedrock of their power was making their money worthless and bankrupting their own population. The wealth was an illusion, a poison disguised as a cure. The foundation of the Spanish economy was crumbling from within, all because they had too much of a good thing. This leads us directly to stage 3, the debt spiral. With their currency devalued and the costs of war still piling up, Spain's financial situation went from bad to catastrophic. To finance their endless conflicts, they had to keep borrowing money from powerful European banking families in Genoa and Germany. At first, they could manage the payments, but as they borrowed more and more, the interest on these loans began to balloon. Soon, they reached a point where the entire government's income wasn't even enough to cover the interest payments, let alone the principal debt. They were trapped. They had to take out new loans just to pay the interest on their old loans. This is the definition of a death spiral. The Spanish crown declared bankruptcy multiple times, essentially telling its creditors, "Sorry, we can't pay you." This destroyed their credibility and made it even harder and more expensive to borrow in the future. The empire was financially hollowed out, a giant on the world stage running on fumes and borrowed time. And so we arrive at the final act of collapse. The period between roughly 1590 and 1670 saw Spain fall into a state of complete and utter economic decay. The consequences of the first 3 stages came home to roost, and the results were devastating. The inflation and debt had crippled the domestic economy. Production of goods within Spain collapsed because it was cheaper to import things than to make them at home. The general population grew poorer and poorer as their money lost its value and opportunities vanished. The constant state of crisis meant the government couldn't invest in its own country. As the economy imploded, so did Spain's military power. They could no longer afford to maintain their massive armies and fleets. The once invincible Spanish forces began to lose key battles. The famous Spanish Armada's defeat against England was a sign of things to come. Other rising powers like the Dutch, the French, and the English started chipping away at Spain's global empire. Most importantly, the Spanish currency, which had once been the world's reserve currency, the dollar of its day, lost that status. No one trusted it anymore. International trade shifted to more stable currencies, and Spain lost a huge source of its global influence. And just like that, the first modern superpower completed the cycle. Overexpansion, currency devaluation, and a crushing debt spiral led to total economic and military collapse. Spain's story became the blueprint, a cautionary tale that would echo through the centuries, ignored by nearly every great power that followed. Spain's empire collapsed. But this was just a dress rehearsal. The same 7-stage process was about to play out again, this time with the largest empire the world had ever seen, the British Empire. And this collapse wouldn't just redraw maps, it would fundamentally change the money in everyone's pockets. So how did the British pound become the world's currency in the first place? Picture the 1800s. London wasn't just a city. It was the financial capital of the planet. Britain ruled the waves, its merchant ships crisscrossing the globe, bringing back untold riches. This was the age of the Industrial Revolution, with British factories churning out goods for the entire world. Their currency, the pound sterling, was rock solid, backed by a massive hoard of gold. Add to that a string of victories in major wars, and you have a recipe for global dominance. Long before the US dollar, the pound was the currency everyone trusted, the one every country wanted to hold in its reserves. But as we've seen, empires that rise must also fall. Let's look at the 7 stages of decline, the British edition. It all starts with stage 1, military overexpansion. By the early 20th century, the British Empire was a behemoth, stretching across 5 continents, from Canada to Australia, India to South Africa. The sun truly never set on it. But managing such a vast, sprawling territory was an immense drain on resources, both financial and military. The sheer cost of policing and administering this global network was staggering. This massive structure was inherently unstable. It simply couldn't be sustained forever. The cracks were beginning to show, even at the height of its power. Then came World War I, which triggered stage 2, currency devaluation. The Great War was a cataclysm that shattered Europe, and Britain was at the heart of it. The economic cost was astronomical. To fund the war effort, Britain was forced to print money and take on the heaviest debts in its history. The solid, gold-backed pound began to wobble. The war bled the nation dry, marking the beginning of the end for its economic supremacy. This leads directly into stage 3, the debt spiral. The war had been won, but the peace was expensive. Britain found itself owing colossal sums of money, primarily to a rising power across the Atlantic, the United States. To stay afloat, Britain had to keep borrowing. This relentless cycle of debt eroded confidence in its economy. In a desperate move, Britain abandoned the gold standard in 1931. The pound, once as good as gold, was now just a piece of paper, its value floating precariously. The anchor of the global financial system had been cut loose. Next, stage 4, the loss of industrial capacity. Britain, the nation that had pioneered the Industrial Revolution, was falling behind. While it was bogged down in colonial administration and wars, other nations, particularly the United States and a reunified Germany, were innovating at a blistering pace. They were developing new technologies and more efficient manufacturing methods. British factories, once the envy of the world, became outdated. The workshop of the world was losing its edge. This decline set the stage for social unrest and political polarization. As the economy faltered and unemployment rose, the gap between the rich and the poor widened. Political battles between left and right grew more intense, paralyzing the government and making it difficult to enact the tough reforms needed to turn the ship around. The internal unity that had helped build the empire was fracturing. Then comes the fatal blow. Stage 6, the collapse of the reserve currency status. The world had changed. After another devastating world war, the old powers were exhausted. In 1944, leaders from the Allied nations gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design a new global economic order. The decision made there was historic. The British pound was officially dethroned. A new king was crowned, the US dollar, backed by the immense industrial power and gold reserves of the United States. For the pound, it was the end of an era. The final stage is the dissolution of the empire itself. Weakened financially and militarily, Britain could no longer hold on to its vast network of colonies. One by one, from India to nations across Africa and the Caribbean, colonies demanded and won their independence. The empire that had once covered a quarter of the globe disintegrated with astonishing speed. By the 1960s, the American century was in full swing. Britain, having completed all the stages of the imperial life cycle, took its new place in a world it no longer dominated. From Spain to Britain, the pattern is eerily similar. Overexpansion, debt, devaluation, and eventual decline. Could a modern superpower, a global giant, collapse in less than 3 years? This isn't the plot of a disaster movie. This is the real, documented story of the Soviet Union. And the most chilling part, the path the United States is on today looks eerily similar. Stick with me, because what I'm about to share connects the dots from the past to our present in a way you might not have seen before. After World War II, the Soviet Union was an undisputed giant on the world stage. It wasn't just a country, it was an empire. They had the largest army on the planet, a nuclear arsenal that could end civilization, and an ideological grip on nearly half the world's population. From Eastern Europe to Asia, their influence was immense. They were leading the space race, sending the first satellite and the first human into orbit, seemingly proving the superiority of their system. From the outside, they looked invincible. But beneath this iron-clad exterior, the foundations were already cracking. The economy, a rigid, centrally planned machine, was slowly grinding to a halt. The seeds of its own destruction were sown long before the final, dramatic collapse. So how did it happen? Historians often point to a clear, 7-stage pattern of imperial decline, and the Soviet Union followed this script almost perfectly. It all started with stage 1, military overexpansion. The turning point was their invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. This decade-long war became their Vietnam. It wasn't just a military quagmire, it was an economic black hole. Billions of rubles were poured into a conflict they couldn't win, bleeding the nation dry and demoralizing its people. This massive drain on resources was the first major domino to fall. This leads us directly to stage 2, currency devaluation. As the war in Afghanistan raged on and the economy weakened, the government tried to maintain the illusion of strength. They spent billions propping up the value of the ruble, a currency that was becoming increasingly worthless on the international stage. Their trade partners began to lose faith. The complex system of trade within the Soviet bloc, which relied on this artificial stability, started to break down. Goods stopped flowing and shortages became more common. The money in people's pockets was losing its value, and the government's attempts to fix it only made things worse, burning through their precious foreign reserves. Then came the crippling blow of stage 3, the debt spiral. The Cold War was, at its heart, an economic battle. The USSR was locked in a relentless arms race with the United States, a nation with a far more dynamic and powerful economy. Trying to keep up was enormously expensive. The Soviets bet heavily on their vast oil and gas reserves to fund their empire. For a while, during the high oil prices of the 1970s, it worked. But in the 1980s, global oil prices collapsed. Suddenly, their main source of hard currency vanished. The state was now facing massive expenses with drastically reduced income. They had no choice but to borrow. And the debt began to spiral out of control, paralyzing the economy. and leaving the government with no good options. This financial crisis exposed the rot at the core of the system, bringing us to stage 4, the loss of industrial capacity. The Soviet planned economy was great at producing tanks and missiles, but terrible at producing, well, almost everything else. There was no incentive for innovation, no reward for efficiency. Factory managers were judged on meeting quotas, not on quality or consumer demand. As a result, Soviet technology fell further and further behind the West. The factories were outdated, the products were shoddy, and the entire industrial base became uncompetitive. They couldn't produce the goods their own people wanted, let alone compete on the global market. The engine of the economy had seized up. With the economy in free fall, the fabric of society began to tear apart. This is stage 5, social decay. Life for the average Soviet citizen became a daily struggle. Shortages of basic necessities like food, soap, and clothing were rampant. Long lines or queues became a symbol of daily life. This hardship bred deep resentment and cynicism. Corruption, which had always existed, became endemic as officials and citizens alike did whatever they could to survive. Black markets flourished, and then the protests started. From the Baltic states to the Caucasus, long-suppressed national identities re-emerged, and people began demanding change, freedom, and an end to the system that had failed them so spectacularly. The social contract was broken. Stage 6, which is the loss of confidence, was now in full swing. The government, under Mikhail Gorbachev, tried to reform the system with policies of glasnost, or openness, and perestroika, or restructuring. But it was too little, too late. Opening the door to criticism just unleashed decades of pent-up anger and frustration. People no longer believed in the communist ideology. They no longer trusted their leaders. The authority of the central government in Moscow evaporated. Republics within the Soviet Union began declaring their sovereignty, effectively ignoring Moscow's rule. The empire was dissolving from within, not from an external attack, but from a complete and total loss of faith in the system itself. And that brings us to the final, shocking act, stage 7, the sudden collapse. In August 1991, hardline communists attempted a coup to reverse the reforms and restore the old order, but it backfired spectacularly. The people, led by figures like Boris Yeltsin, stood up against them. The coup collapsed in 3 days, and with it, any remaining authority of the Soviet state. What followed was a rapid, stunning chain of events. One by one, the republics declared independence. By Christmas Day of 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned, and the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. A superpower that had dominated the globe for half a century, that had possessed thousands of nuclear warheads and the largest army in history, had completely dissolved. From the first major cracks to the final collapse, it took just a few short years, around 900 days. It wasn't a bang, it was a sudden, quiet implosion. So why have we spent all this time on a history lesson? Because that 7-stage model of decline. It's not just about the Soviet Union. It's a pattern that has repeated throughout history. And when we look at the United States today, the parallels are impossible to ignore. Let's look at the evidence. Stage 1. Military overexpansion. The United States currently has military bases in over 80 countries and has been engaged in continuous multi-trillion-dollar conflicts for over 2 decades. This level of military spending dwarfs that of any other nation and puts an enormous strain on the national budget. Stage 2. Currency devaluation. To pay for this spending and to stimulate the economy, there has been unprecedented money printing. This has led to persistent inflation, eroding the purchasing power of every dollar you have. The value of your savings is actively being diminished. Stage 3. The debt spiral. The US national debt is at a record high, soaring past $34 trillion. We see recurring political crises over raising the debt ceiling, which is essentially just arguing over whether to pay the bills for money we've already spent. This isn't sustainable. Stage 4. Loss of industrial capacity. For decades, America has outsourced its manufacturing base primarily to China in pursuit of cheaper labor. We've gone from being the world's workshop to being the world's biggest consumer, reliant on other nations for essential goods, a vulnerability that became terrifyingly clear during the pandemic. And that puts the United States squarely in stage 5, social decay. Look around. We are more politically and socially polarized than at any time since the Civil War. There's a growing distrust in institutions, from the government to the media. We see rising social unrest, a sense of hopelessness in many communities, and fierce debates over the very identity and future of the nation. The signs of stage 6, the loss of confidence, can no longer be hidden. Around the world, countries are actively seeking alternatives to the US dollar for international trade. Alliances are shifting. The unipolar moment, where America was the undisputed global leader, is over. The world is becoming multipolar, and the faith in America's long-term stability and leadership is visibly weakening. The Soviet Union thought it was forever. The Roman Empire thought it was eternal. The British Empire believed the sun would never set on it. For the last 500 years, every single superpower, every empire, has eventually followed this pattern and fallen. So the question we have to ask ourselves is this: can America really be the exception? If this video made you think, please hit that like button, subscribe for more content that challenges the narrative, and share your thoughts in the comments below.